Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Sense of Belonging and Navigating Imposter Syndrome workshop. We have special guests with us today that I'll be introducing you into a second. My name is Tatiana Pedroza. I'm Assistant Dean for Student Affairs for the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics, and we're excited to have you. So today we have Dr. Marcos Ortega with us, Yanisa Renega, and Isaac Magallanes. So I'm super excited to hear from them and hear their stories. We're going to be, kind of going through what is imposter syndrome, how do we kind of relate to it, and then really kind of diving into, what does this mean in the realm of STEM, right? What does it mean in science and mathematics? And then we'll be passing it on to our alum that are here with us today. We're super excited to have them and to see you. And we'll hear from them and where they're at in their journeys and their stories. And we'll see what they have to share with us. For the panel itself, so since we have multiple people that are going to be sharing their stories and talking, we do ask the participants that are here kind of joining us today, if you could please keep yourself on mute during the panel so we could give people time to talk. But we do want to hear from you and we do want you to ask questions. So if you have questions while we're talking, write them down. You could also use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom page. Go ahead and chat in your questions throughout. If we don't get to them throughout the Zoom, we could definitely answer them after. And we will be recording the session to post to our NSM Success Team website so students could go ahead and watch this later. And with that, we do have our Student Success Team that's here to support you. So this is my shameless plug. We have a retention specialist, college advisor, career specialist, graduation specialist. Brittany, Sam, are you in the room? Natalie, Shonda? We're here to support you. So our role is to support students throughout their time at Cal State Fullerton. We are here again to really kind of walk you through and help you navigate, right, what it is to be an NSM major, what it is to be a Cal State Fullerton student. So please don't hesitate, reach out to us, and we're here for you. And you can connect with us in multiple ways. So we have the College of Natural Science and Mathematics Facebook and Instagram. We have the NSM Student Success Center Instagram. We also have the NSM ICC, who is also sponsoring this event for us tonight. Thank you, Interclub Council. I see Sonali in the room, thank you. And we also have our email address. So if you are trying to get a hold of us or want to get a hold of us, connect with us. These are all the different ways. Screenshot this, save it for your notes, and reach out to us and follow us too. The easiest way for us to share information and workshops right now is through social media. So please, please, please follow, like, subscribe. Is that what I'm supposed to say? Cool. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Marcos Ortega. Thank you for being with us. I think you're on mute, Dr. Ortega. Sorry.
My bad. Evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Am I good now? All right, awesome. Like Tatiana said, my name is Marcos Ortega. I'm a professor of biochemistry in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, and I'm in my 4th year here. I guess it seems a little bit longer with COVID. Actually, I want to start off with this question, like, why imposter syndrome? I want to really throw it back to Tatiana, to be honest with you, because this was her idea. This was her, this was something that she approached me about. So maybe she can share with us why she thought this was important.
Yes, thank you so much. And really, with the Student Success Team and meeting with students throughout, the last couple semesters, especially being virtual, we wanted to have community, right? We wanted to have space for students to connect. And also kind of really diving into what is imposter syndrome. We hear it a lot. I think people connect with it, feeling like you don't belong or feeling like you're not good enough or you're not, succeeding in whatever area you're in. And really, what we want to do and what we kept hearing from students is like, how do I connect, right? Like, how do I find this sense of belonging? And we're kind of also talking back to that, right? Like the imposter syndrome itself, it gives people and students a message that, you don't belong in spaces, right? And it kind of gets internalized. And then Dr. Ortega is going to kind of really dive into that today more. And, for us as advisors and, meeting one-on-one with students, hearing this, we want you to know you're not alone, right? Like you do belong, you are going to succeed, and we're here to support you. And most importantly, we want you to believe in yourselves, right? And to create this community space, to know that we have your back, other students have your back. And, your story, it is personal, and it is, your story, and it is very much, a part of who you are. But it also, isn't probably, you're probably not the only one that's feeling that way, right? So we wanted to kind of just hold the space for all of you and be in community with each other, and, kind of hear from alum, hear from people that have gone through this, right? And maybe we could learn some takeaways from that. Thank you, Dr. Ortega. I'll throw it back to you.
So when Tatiana asked me to do this, right, and I'll just be, what you'll find today and this evening, though, for those that know me, you'll know this already, but those of you don't, I'm pretty open and honest. I feel as an educator, if I'm not sharing my story, if I'm not sharing myself, I'll never have the kind of impact that I want to have on students in the classroom, in the lab, and on a larger scale. So part of that is the struggle of trying to find identity, to find your place in the world, regardless of where you are and where you come from. So when Tatiana asked me about this, like, it really aligned with how I view education. I don't view education as only in the classroom. I view it as extending from the classroom and hopefully helping you navigate life by teaching you lessons in the classroom. So of course I said yes, and I thought this was really awesome. And it's kind of centered in the course I'm teaching. This is for all NSM majors, but applies to everybody. It's kind of figuring out, how do we navigate college? How do we navigate success? How do we navigate failure? How do we find resources? How do we find community? And so I aligned with a lot of the things I'm doing in class, but also just how I view education in general. So of course I said yes. And so let's go to the next slide, and then kind of just start with a question, right? And this is more towards me, and then it'll initiate the conversation that we'll have on a larger scale. So would you view me as an imposter, right? Am I an imposter? And let's define what imposter is, right? Very simplistically, an imposter is a fraud, somebody who is pretending, somebody who's not real. Could be something that's, viewed as fake almost. So would you think I'm an imposter? It's kind of, and if you want to, you can hit me in the chat, right? I do it in my classrooms. Do you think I'm an imposter? Anybody? Nobody? No. No. And Andres, I know Andres. Ryan, no way. No. So I anticipated those answers. I appreciate participation, right? That's a big thing. Could never. So I appreciate that, the responses. But the imposter isn't how it's viewed from the outside, it's how it's viewed from the inside. And that's the thing, right? So it's about, do I view myself as an imposter? And so to relate that, I'm going to, and these people and the students that are here that know me know I'm full of stories and anecdotes, but with points, obviously. And I'll share a couple of things where hopefully shows you how I really do view myself, right? And so I'm in my fourth year, but before I was at Cal State Fullerton, I was at a small liberal arts called McAllister College, where I was a biochemistry professor there. My first tenure track job, permanent position, where I had my own lab, my own office. It was a great position. I did really well. But I wanted to have a larger impact on students that needed help. So I looked for another job and then luckily landed this job. Very fortunate to help a population of students that I really identify with and really feel like need good instructors and good people to impact them in the lab and outside the lab. And so, but the thing was, though, I was so afraid to tell my previous department chair and provost that I had, and I've shared this story with a few people, that I had gotten a new position. I didn't tell them for like a month and a half because I was really afraid. And I was afraid that they would judge me. I was afraid that they would get mad at me, to be honest with you. I had invested so much in the institution and the department and the students that I thought they were gonna be disappointed in me, and I was gonna feel this backlash from my department, from my chair, from the provost, from the students. And I was so scared of that response that I didn't tell anybody for 6 weeks. And then one day my department chair caught me in the corner. I mean, she didn't do it on purpose, but she needed some help with some experiments. And she asked me just a simple question, and I couldn't hold it any longer. So I blurted out, I accepted a new position at Cal State Fullerton, and I'm going to be leaving in the spring, at the end of the spring, and then starting there in the fall. And I was just waiting for her to just be mad. And she started crying. And she was genuinely sad and hugged me and said, we thought this might happen. We hoped it never would. And she had a very emotional response of sadness, but also happiness, because she knew that I needed to be closer to my family. I needed to feel like I'm having a larger impact on the population of students that need more help. And so she called the provost, if those who don't know, is basically the head of all professors. She's the provost at that point, is female. She was in charge of academic affairs and in charge of all the curriculum in all our departments. And so she called her really quickly and told her, and she had the same response. You can't leave. I need to talk to you right now. Please let me, convince you otherwise. And I was so shocked by that response that I didn't even see it coming. I had anticipated something negative, and what I felt was love. But it had nothing to do with how they saw me. It was how I saw myself. Like, I shouldn't have been there in the first place, that I was lucky to get the job, that I was afraid every day that somebody was going to wake up and realize, like, this dude shouldn't even have his own lab. He shouldn't be teaching biochemistry or cancer biology. And my lens was like, I didn't belong there in the first place. So it's the fear of being caught and being called out. And I was going to give them a reason to call me out. And I couldn't sleep for 6 weeks because of it. But then I had to realize that it's something that I've been living with my whole life, I guess, because I've been chasing a dream that's, I guess, never been real for me, because it's not something that I can go ask somebody, like, how do you do this? My parents don't know. My friends don't know. Not many people went to college where I come from. So it's a new thing I'm navigating, and how to navigate that's been pretty tough. And so that's 4 years ago. Fast forward 4 years to, now, and those of you in my class will hear the same story. I just reviewed some grants for NSF based on curriculum. They're trying to implement pilot programs that will help retention and graduation rates, specifically at HSIs. And I was invited to review 11 grants at different institutions trying to implement curriculum that'll help retention and graduation. It's something I really believe in. It's something I'm doing currently. And I thought, this is an awesome opportunity. I'll do it. But when I got invited and I got the 11 grants to read, I could hardly sleep because I'm so stressed about, am I going to do it right? Are they going to know this is my first time? Am I going to be viewed as dumb? Am I going to be saying things that, don't even matter? And I can't even sleep or think of some nights because I'm thinking about, like, what's going to happen when I show up on this panel full of faculty and they find out that I don't even belong here in the first place. So even though I was shown love 4 years earlier, and my former institution held my job and held my lab and loved me so much that they wanted to offer me a lot of money, and I said no in the end, I still 4 years later carry that same thing, that I don't belong here. I'm scared that they'll find out. I'm not prepared. I'm not as smart. I'm not as capable. And it's something I carry every day. And I only laugh because that's my defense mechanism. So when Tatiana asked me this, of course, I thought, I'll say yes, because I've been living this, I guess, the majority of my adult life, fearing that somebody will catch me. When there's nothing to catch, I guess, in the end. And that's why I have to reflect on over and over again. So am I an imposter? In my mind, I am. And that's why I thought it was okay. So if you want to keep going, Tatiana. So now let's define what imposter syndrome, right? It's that feeling that you don't belong for some reason. And it's this notion that we don't deserve what we get. We didn't earn it. We don't belong there. We're a fraud playing a role, and eventually we'll be found out as that fraud. And it's that fear, and it can play out in a lot of different ways. It can be related to gender. It can be related to culture. It could be related to where you come from. It could be related to your socioeconomic status. Like, there is not one thing. It's the burden we carry based on a set of standards. And if those standards don't make sense to us, then we feel like we don't make sense in that world. And so it's that imposter syndrome that's trying to obtain a standard that oftentimes isn't realistic and often isn't inclusive. So that's trying to define it a little bit more rigidly, right? Because we're scientists. So how do we define it is the thing about how do we experience, and this has been well studied. So it's not something that's coming out of left field. It's been well studied for a lot of years. So how do we know if we're experiencing it? And so there's a few telltale signs. If we go to the next one, what we can see is this has been categorized as what has been viewed as suffering from imposter syndrome. If you have two of these six things, right? And the imposter cycle, meaning that you'll always feeling that you're the imposter, even if you're viewed as success, 4 years later, you still think like, I'm not worthy, right? And then because of that, now you have to be special and the best at everything. And that goes into being a Superman or Superwoman or super person. That's the view that I have to be the best, and, and I have to be perfect, essentially. That's what it comes down to. And because you think you have to be perfect, then there's that fear of failure. If you don't have that perfect day every day, then I'm a failure and I don't belong. And then, and even if you do, obtain that perfection every day, which is not realistic, let's say you do. People say they love you and people say you're great. And you're like, no. And the denial of ability and the discounting of praise. And I get that, believe me. And it's this thing where you tell me I'm good, but in my mind, I'm thinking, no, not good enough. I messed up that one time. And I focus on the one and not the other 10 that I did right. And it's that guilt that you feel when you're not successful, even though we're just human in the end. So if you feel two of any of these six things, they say you're suffering from imposter syndrome. And is it suffering like from COVID and passing from it? No, but the psychological impacts are still impacted. So it's this thing where we still feel pain, even though it's not, fixed by a Band-Aid. So this has been, categorized as the things that give rise to imposter syndrome. And they're all centered around adhering to a standard that's unrealistic. And that kind of is the lens of imposter syndrome, the lens that is naturally exclusive and not inclusive. And that's kind of why I love this topic, not because I love talking about having anxiety and stress my whole life, but because I naturally care about inclusivity and equity. And this fits right into that. And I think that's a very important thing to discuss, especially today. So if we want to keep going. So now we know what the problem is. It's been there forever. It's centered in this exclusive model that keeps most of us out because we're not perfect and we can never be perfect. It's the lens that these are the standards, regardless if you can understand or even obtain them. If you don't do that, then you're not worthy of this place. And so it's a naturally exclusive lens that I've always tried to break down by having a wider lens, a more inclusive lens, a more diverse lens, more voices. But if you don't have that, what are the impacts of it? Do people really suffer from this? Like, are they suffering mentally? Yes. But is there something you can quantify and say, there is suffering from this? And there is. And it's been well studied, like I said. So what are some of the impacts? The impacts are the people that feel that they're naturally going to do less than they think they can because of that fear. So if we keep going. So this was studied, and it's been well studied, but it was studied specifically in STEM. And this was in PLOS One, which is a well-respected journal. And what they took was about 400 graduate students. And they interviewed them and what they try to do is like understand their view of themselves. And what they found was, and they did a pretty extensive study, was that the students who felt two of those six, who felt imposter syndrome, were way less productive than the other students who did not feel those things. And it was women and students of color or first-generation college students. And what they did was they were less productive. And it wasn't because they were, less capable, and it wasn't because they weren't as smart. They were afraid, and they didn't know how to navigate the system. And what they found, they tracked these students, though, when they started working with them and helping them build confidence and gave them more rigid structure. Here's the expectations, here's what you have to do, and then move forward. What they found is these students, they met up with everybody else, right? They rise to the same productivity level as everybody else. Once they didn't feel that anxiety of being found out as frauds, the fear of failure, the fear of, praise even. So the outcomes of this is if we don't feel included in the process, if we don't understand the process and are afraid to engage the process because of fear, we're going to be naturally less productive. But even long term, we're not going to try things that we might be good at. And we're not going to be able to excel in ways that we could because of fear. And so these have real lasting impacts. And that's not just a psychological impact, that's a socioeconomic impact. If you think about somebody who has imposter syndrome, is capable of being a boss, but they're afraid of trying to go for promotion. They're feeling the impacts economically, not just psychologically. So these things have lasting impacts. And what we need to do is have a more inclusive lens so that we can include everybody in the conversation, set the guidelines, make them realistic, make them above surface so that everybody can reach for that. And then when you feel that success, you feel like you're part of that process. So these are real things that are felt by real people with real impacts, not just in one person, but in communities and in cities and in states and in families. So if you keep going, Tatiana. So we've discussed the problem, we've discussed the impacts. So how can we increase sense of belonging, especially in STEM and academia? Because those are places that are naturally exclusive, right? I'm not saying that I'm a scientist, I'm an academic. I'm not saying that I'm in this club and you can't be in it. But it was kind of structured that way decades ago. And it's been hard to break down those walls. So what the things I work on and other people like Tatiana and a lot of people in NSM work on is trying to increase participation. And by doing that, being more inclusive and having a wider lens, a more inclusive lens. So we set guidelines and standards and the baseline of what success is. Success isn't a 4.0 for everybody. And we're navigating what does inclusion look like in the classroom? What does inclusion look like as academics? What does inclusion look like when it comes to job expectations and things like that? So how can we increase the sense of belonging is by having conversations and including everybody in the process. And let's give it a name. That's called systemic change. And it's really hard though, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Systemic change is necessary. We're feeling this stuff today, like we do every day. I wish I didn't have to have difficult conversations with my children about what we're dealing with today, when it comes to police shootings or the things that I've had to, my children had to see me go through. And so I wish we could have systemic change overnight, but that's not realistic. We should be working towards that by having the conversation and initiating these long processes. But what can we do today? I think about this as a marathon. And a marathon isn't one in that first step. It's one step after step after step after step after step. It's not a race. It's something we got to grind out every day. And then we can have systemic change, but it's a long-term process. It's something that's like working in the lab, requires time, patience, and effort. So you keep going. So it's hard, but we must focus on living on the day-to-day. So how can we live day-to-day with that imposter syndrome? And before we include in the process, not drive ourselves crazy like I have for the last 20 years, because I don't encourage that for anybody. How do we do that, right? I think that's what we wanted to have this discussion today. How do we navigate this, live day to day with that anxiety of feeling like you'll be found out one day, or that you're not capable, or you feel stupid, or any label that somebody's put on you your whole life, right? So that's what we're trying to navigate today. So if you keep going, Tatiana. And it's about maintaining our individuality, our sense of ourselves in a world that's so rigidly defined. That means, I think about it as this, and it is what it is, right? I think about this as like, why do we call some neighborhoods good and some bad? Why do we have to define it that way? Why is this school good and this school bad? My kids go to a 3 or 4 school. I don't think it's a bad school. I think the kids there don't have a lot of socioeconomic means. And with that comes some challenges in learning. So what I'm trying to do is like, how do we build these things to where they're more connected? And there's not good and bad, but everybody's working towards the same goal. And that's that thing of inclusion and equity. And so it's about pulling these pieces from each world and trying bringing them together. And we talked about this the other day, me, Tatiana, Isaac, and Yanis, about 2 worlds, right? I grew up in a border town, and I'll say it, right? I grew up when my mom calls my friends the homies in the hood. And then now I live in an academic world, which is so distant from that. How do I put these 2 worlds together and maintain my individuality? That's what we should be doing, and having these conversations and trying to figure it out. It's not easy, but you don't do it by not participating. So I thank you everybody for showing up today. So you want to keep going, Tatiana? To help you think about how you maintain your identity in this rigidly defined world, and how do we change that daily and hopefully long term. We were going to have Yanis and Isaac share their stories with us. They're currently going through this. I'm an old man I can handle it. How do students handle it? They have a better perspective on this. So let's welcome them and thank them for sharing their stories with us.
So I could jump in here a little bit. We, again, want to thank you both. If you want to go ahead and start, Eunice, and people in the chat, if you want to go ahead and ask questions, you can start asking questions right now. But first, maybe introduce yourself and maybe share where you're at currently in the world, because we also know you're not local. And what time is it over there? And maybe we could pass it over to Isaac after, and then we could jump into questions from the chat. Go ahead, Eunice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eunice. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study biochemistry and molecular biophysics. But when I was at Cal State Fullerton, I was a biochem major, and I was in the lab of Dr. Niroshika Kepitipola and Dr. Meyer. He was my very first lab, but he's no longer at Fullerton. Yeah, and I just passed my qualifying exam, so that was definitely a time when I could think of when I felt imposter syndrome. So I can talk about that.
Thank you so much. Isaac?
Hey everyone, my name is Isaac Magallanes. I am currently at the University of Chicago, so I'm in Chicago right now. It's around 8 p.m. I am in the Committee of Evolutionary Biology, which is a program that basically focuses on a lot of things, but the way it's sort of materializing in my experience here is I'm studying the evolution of teeth in mammals, looking at fossil mammals and seeing how that evolution takes place in terms of looking at the shape of teeth through time. And I would say that right now, one of the interesting things is that Eunice, you just did your qualifying exams. I have mine in about a month. Or at least my version of the qualifying exams. In my program, we do it our second year in, and I'm currently going through it right now. So I think there's a lot of ways that sort of imposter syndrome is sort of showing up, and yeah, I'm happy to talk about it.
Thank you. Eunice, yeah, I think congratulations, first of all, for passing the exam. But yeah, how did this play out? Like with your first maybe couple of years of grad school, in a PhD, moving away from home? If you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I want to really like share during this session is like the overwhelming amount of support that I had when I was at Fullerton, and how that really impacted my ability to even like gain the courage to apply to graduate school. Like when, so I was in the MARC program, which is a 2-year scholarship where you basically prepare to apply to a PhD program. And even when I was applying to that, I did it like half-heartedly because I was like very nervous about the commitment and like not thinking that I had it in me. And, you know, just like I was only beginning to do research. And then when I finally joined MARC, like my whole life changed. Like, you know, I had so many mentors, and they all like were always telling me about different opportunities on campus, summer research and symposiums. And then like just like the thought of even like traveling and like showing my research, like my parents, you know, our vacations growing up were like going to Mexico and visiting my grandparents. So like being able to go to like San Diego or like Chicago was like huge for me, and like having someone pay for it. And so like I think all those little things really helped me like keep going, and like realize that people believed in me. And then now like that I'm in graduate school, I'm like, oh wow, like those people and that amount of support were a big part of me getting over my imposter syndrome during my college years. And I've struggled a little bit more now that I'm in graduate school because I don't have the same like amount or maybe quality of support that I had at Fullerton. But nonetheless, like I've found like places and things that make me feel supported. Like I'm president of the Latin graduate student organization, and you know I find other friends that are going through the same things as me. And when you find like one professor or a postdoc, a grad student, like you just make friends with them and make sure that you check in. Like, I think some of the things that I've had to work on is like with when I experience imposter syndrome, I usually kind of just like shy away and I'm like, oh no, I got this, or I do bare minimum to kind of just like get through. And like I think that's not the best like thing, because when I was at Fullerton, I was doing a bunch of things. So I had all this confidence, and so that's how I got to where I am. And like having these workshops actually helped me to realize that, oh, I'm actually experiencing imposter syndrome right now. So that's, I don't know, I can let Isaac give a little, um, his 2 cents as well.
Yeah. So, sorry, Tatiana, could you repeat the prompt?
Yeah, so I think, well, first, I think Denise, like, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think, kind of where we come from culturally, sometimes it's really hard to ask for help. I know, like, for me, I was kind of taught, like, that might be something that means that you're not doing something right, right? Or maybe don't know what you're doing, and it gets internalized, right, in a certain way. So asking for help, I think, is super hard, right? Especially if it's not something that we're used to doing. We're used to just doing things on our own. I kind of call it the hustle mentality, where you're just like, I'm so used to just like getting things done as fast and as soon as I can. But then forgetting, like, oh, I have a whole support system that has my back. And they might be, for you, like thousands of miles away, right? But like I was saying, like, we're still here, your family's still here, and it's just like, how do you navigate that? So with distance, right? Especially now, especially virtual, especially in a pandemic, right? So I'm sure that adds like other layers to that. So thank you for sharing. Isaac, I think we're kind of just thinking about like maybe starting at Cal State Fullerton. How was your experience? And then maybe now, like, how are you navigating that being away from home? But anyone in the chat, please, or anyone here, please feel free to ask questions in the chat too. Thank you.
Yeah. So when I was at Cal State Fullerton, because I graduated in 2017, I believe. When I was at Cal State Fullerton, I had a couple different support networks. I think the primary one was always my family. One of the things that I think I carry with me everywhere I go is just the knowledge that my family is behind me, that they are really proud of what I do. And even at times where I'm doubting my own ability, or I'm doubting whether or not I'm capable of 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 seeing through what I've agreed to do. I always remember that, like, my parents, my brother, my sister, they're supporting me, and that's something that really motivates me. And I think that, like, when I was at home, that was something that was always very tangible. Like, I remember working really late at night, trying to prepare for a test, or trying to get a poster ready for a presentation at a conference somewhere. And I remember my mom, like, walking behind me and just like touching my shoulder and just being like, good job, like, you're doing it. And that was something that was, for me, like, it's funny, like, when you're in it, sometimes it's hard to understand how important those kinds of things are, but when it's absent, it can be very apparent. And so I would say, yeah, like, so in that way, like, my family has always just been a very strong support network for me. And when I was specifically at Cal State Fullerton, I think one of the things that I always rely on anywhere I go are personal connections. And when I was at Cal State Fullerton, my connection with my advisor was a very professionally, and also just as terms as a friend. I no longer work with him, but I still consider him a very close friend. It was something that also kept me going through. I think when I first got to Cal State Fullerton, I showed a lot of curiosity. I was interested in science, but I didn't start as a science major. So I also kind of like consistently battled with that hurdle of, like, when I was in high school, I was considered a kid that was really bad at science. And now I've somehow made it into a PhD where that's all I'm doing. And so there's always some sort of like dissonance between those two things. I'm like, am I actually good at this thing, or am I just kind of here because of inertia has just kind of pushed me forward to where I am? But when I was at Cal State Fullerton, my advisor, Jim Parham, he was teaching Geology 101, and I started off as a geology major once I transferred into NSM. And he always he always like gave me like affirmation and assurance. He would tell me like, listen, this is a project that is interesting. What do you think about it? And he would let me kind of talk about it. And then he would be like, that's a good idea. We should build on that. And I think that was something that I like saw that just really helped give me confidence. And when I moved on from Cal State Fullerton, it was something that like I actively sought in every advisor that I was talking to. I was like, does this person seem like someone who is going to not necessarily hold my hand, but give me, give me affirmation when I need it. Tell me that like, hey, these are good ideas. You should follow them through. And one of the ways that like COVID has impacted that is that like faculty are very inaccessible right now. It's very difficult to meet faculty in a way in which, before the pandemic started, I was very used to just walking down the hall and just being like, hey, does this make any sense? Am I following, a rabbit hole that leads nowhere? And so I think that's one of the things that's like been very difficult for me during this entire experience of doing graduate school, particularly preparing for like, quals during COVID, is just like, there's not a lot of communication. And I think that that's something that I really thrive off of. I really benefit from having not necessarily like oversight or micromanagement, but I benefit from having, communication with faculty and the people who I've chosen, because that's one of the things you do when you're in graduate school is you choose your committee, you choose the people you're going to work with. And sometimes that's based off of, what they do in terms of how it serves your interest in research. Or sometimes it's also like, this person kind of does what I do, but also they're just a really good advocate for me. And I think that for me, it's the type of support that I received at Cal State Fullerton. I've seen that I consistently seek that out. And thankfully I do have some faculty that provide me that, but sometimes COVID can make those kinds of things hard.
Thank you. And I'm hearing advocacy is like huge as well. We do have a question in the chat from Bianca. Do you have any recommendations on how to reach out to faculty for someone who is very shy? Either of you can answer.
I think it's funny. I actually experienced this week where I'm in the process of writing my proposal and really trying to like hash out exactly like what my hypotheses are, what I expect to see in patterns in data that I do not have. So a lot of it is kind of just like I kind of have to like make some predictions and have some well-founded hypotheses based off of that, and that can be really hard to do in a vacuum when you don't have a lot of access to faculty. And I think one of the things that has helped, and I've had like my partner also just like consistently like tell me, is like, it can be very hard initially, but sometimes just like reaching out to faculty and just being like, hey, I'm kind of unsure right now about a lot of things. Does any of this make sense? It can seem like it's a very like, it's a very vulnerable like email to send. And it can be very difficult to write it because you kind of feel like you're admitting defeat. And I think that that's something that I also struggle with, is like, sometimes I feel like asking for help is admitting that I couldn't do it on my own. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like reaching out to faculty, I think that like, it never hurts to contact them directly, and that can be difficult. So I also like use my friendship network. So like I look at my peers, and like sometimes I'll ask like, hey, when you talk to this faculty, how do you, are they open? Are they available? Do they respond? I was actually talking to one of my peers today, and I was just like, hey, I'm trying to get this person, and I'm just kind of very nervous of talking to them about some of my doubts that I have, some self-doubt that I have, and like, what should I do? And they were just like, well, this is how I phrase things. And I think if you phrase things like this, they'll be very receptive. And so I think I rely on my peers as well.
Thank you. Denise?
I guess I can add, like, right now during COVID, one advantage is that if you're kind of shy, I don't know if this is better or worse, but you can just send the initial email saying like, hey, can we meet and talk over Zoom? And I think they're more likely to like be like, okay, let's meet for like 30 minutes, and then kind of one of my, I guess the biggest advice I could give too, because I deal with this too, is like, and maybe it has to do with my imposter syndrome, is that you really have to not take things personally. Like, I think a lot of my imposter syndrome comes from like not wanting to hurt other people's feelings or coming off as like stupid. So then everything I do is like always with like, but then they're gonna think this of me. Then they're gonna, and so like I'm really learning to just kind of let go. And I think you're gonna be more successful if you kind of stop caring what people think a little bit and don't take things so personally. Sometimes people are stressed out, they're busy, you know, XYZ, and it honestly might not have anything to do with you. Why they don't reply, email them again, especially professors. I think Dr. Ortega would agree.
Definitely. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Ortega.
Keep doing that. I've been doing this for months too. I had somebody hit me privately in the chat and ask a question. Maybe they're shy or something. But it's related to, so then it aligns with Yanis and Isaac. So it sounds like you both had really good foundational support community at Cal State Fullerton, which allowed you to kind of excel and even apply to grad school and seek the PhD and believe that you had the value and potential to do that. Like, that's not a lot of places that aren't going to do that sometimes. But now you're in a different world. You're at UPenn, you're at UChicago. Those are very, very good schools with that good, you know, in air quotes, that means it's going to have a different demographic there. How's the diversity there on campus, and does it have an impact on how you view yourself now? Do you feel a difference in the culture? Do you feel a difference in how you view yourself?
I can start, I guess. So for me personally, it impacts me a lot. I think some of like the biggest differences that I see is, for one, Cal State Fullerton is a very diverse campus. The University of Chicago is not. It is, yeah, it is. There's not a lot of people who look like me or who come from the kind of backgrounds that I come from. I'm from Anaheim, California, just down the street from Cal State Fullerton, actually, and I went to high school like, you know, a stone's throw away from Cal State Fullerton. So like suddenly being in like one of the sort of most affluent neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, and then being in a school that's got so much funding and has different types of people who come from money is very challenging at times, especially because I think one of the things that like I feel a lot is that the stakes are different. Like I feel that constantly, and that like sometimes I feel that if I mess up or if I don't do well, then it's all over for me. And like I don't get to go back to like, you know, my you know, I don't get to go back to comfort. I have to go back to struggling financially. I have to go back to dealing with all the things that my family has dealt with in the past. And it can be like it can be a motivator at times, but it can also just be the driver of a lot of stress. And some of the ways that I find, and it can be very isolating too, I think, because I look at my peers and they're going to, you know, like their apartments are partially paid for by their parents, or they're getting to go do all these things, and I'm like, I'm saving money because I'm sending money back home because I'm helping my parents stay afloat as well. Like it can be very like, whoa, I'm living a very like, we're here at the same place, but we're living very different lives. I think one of the things that helps me a lot is it can be very easy to, again, let that isolate you. But sometimes just talking to like other students and kind of asking about their stories and asking where they come from, especially if you have some sort of like common interest or some sort of common shared experience. There's a lot of student advocacy groups here at UChicago that are specifically focused at like increasing underrepresented minority enrollment and retention here at the university. I talked to my peers who are part of this group, and a lot of them, I mean, not everyone's story is the same, but a lot of our experiences overlap in terms of how we feel around them. When we experience world events, we feel very similar. And I think that's something that kind of helps me feel not alone, and helps me realize that like, oh, you know, if they're doing okay, and if they have support, and if they found support in other ways, I can find that support too. So I think it's a thing of like, there's almost like a shared network of resources that we that we utilize that are related to the university, and then not related at all, just amongst ourselves. Like sometimes it just helps to unload, emotionally, and have someone be like, no, I feel that, like, I get that. It's not difficult. And that helps a lot when you're talking to people who you feel are sort of, like you in different ways.
How about you, Yanis?
So what was the question again? Like, how does it feel?
So you came from a very supportive, diverse environment. Do you have that same diversity and support where you are currently at a good Ivy League school that probably has a different demographic than Cal State Fullerton?
Yeah. I mean, no. It's like Penn is so like when I first got here my first year, like I was really close to my cohort and everything. It was a blast, free food all the time and alcohol and everything was new, and meeting new people, new research that I've never been exposed to. Like I fell in love with epigenetics, like, so it was really fun, like the first couple of years. And but I think when it really started to get hard for me, and like I realized, well, the pandemic happened, but then also just like even though I was having more fun in the first 2 years, I always missed my family. And it was a little bit easier to deal with it when, I could get distracted, go out, run. Like I was doing all these things and getting distracted, connecting with other people. But during the pandemic, I really felt it because I can't necessarily be around other people as much. And I do feel lonely. And I also feel a lot of the same things that Isaac feels, where your family back home is experiencing one thing and you feel like, that's my life. And honestly, the whole time I've been here, I feel like that's my life. And I'm just kind of doing a summer program right now. And once I finish, I'm going to go back and help my family. And, and I think every time now that I talk to my parents about it, they're like, no, that is your life. And the sooner you realize that, the easier it's going to get every time you miss something that's happening home. Like like, don't look at it as like you're missing out. It's like, no, you're living your life now. Like you're in your PhD, you might end up getting a job over there, or, and so that's been really hard for me, like trying to accept that this is my life. And it's just, I'm not used to it because I don't have anyone here that is like my rock. But things that I do to cope with it is like, yeah, like working out. And I FaceTime my family like almost every day, whether it's my mom, my brother, my dad. Like I talk to them almost every day. And I mean, I found support, like how Isaac said as well, like through different organizations, or like other Latinos, or like other people that maybe come from this, like a similar upbringing as me. Because yeah, like I've also experienced, like, it's kind of hard to make friends when you didn't grow up the same. Like you can tell right away, like, yeah, I don't identify or have the same conversations with people that, like, vacation on these lavish things or whatever. So yeah, that's hard to navigate, but it doesn't mean that I don't deserve to be here. Like I've had great opportunities while at Penn. Like I was asked to like co-host a podcast, like all these things that people are still looking out for me, and I just need to like be positive about it, take those opportunities and be confident. And it's honestly, I still struggle with it, especially right now with the pandemic. Like I struggle with feeling like 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 I deserve to be here, and like I'm going to finish, because sometimes I do think about quitting, but it's just because I miss my family, and maybe, I'm not close enough to graduation or something. But yeah, I think we talked about this in the other meeting, or like, I also have like really clung to my culture. So like there's days on the weekends where I'll just go and like find like the food or make the food that my mom used to make me. So you can do that stuff too.
Thanks for sharing, Janice. Yanis, so when I'm hearing like, you know, and I think it's something we've talked about previously and that we continue to talk about, and I started talking about, like, is the sense of belonging is tied to kind of how we were raised in a lot of foundational things for us, right? Our family, our communities, our schools, and then trying to replicate that in other places, and it's kind of hard. And Ivan was the one who asked me that, so he said he didn't mean to do it just to me, but to everybody else, because he asked me. We've discussed this many times about I was the only, you know, Latino in my grad program, and it was a big grad program, and we talked about this and how I felt connected to people is, and I shared this with Yanis and Isaac and Tatiana. I probably talked more to sometimes the cleaning staff than I did to anybody else, because we shared a language and we shared food. And I would go to, and I'm not a super religious person because I've always had my problems with the church and the lack of answers to some of my questions, and the nuns didn't like that. But I would go to church sometimes on Sunday so I could hear mass in Spanish and have a pan dulce and feel like my parents were next to me. So it's trying to, and this is that dichotomy, right? It's like these two worlds and having a foot in both, but feeling you're not in 100% either one. And your parents don't understand what you're doing in grad school, but they're, you know, even if they did, even if they were close, they still wouldn't understand completely. It's this thing that we're trying to navigate it's really, really hard. And I wish we could all put answers in the chat that make everything go better. But ultimately what we have to do is find our path and find our community and find our support and gain the confidence back and then try harder again, because that's the only way we get through it. And then trying to bring other people through the door. My main thing in grad school, when I was going through this, I found other students of color and other students who weren't from privilege. And we started a diversity organization. And that was in the late 90s. And there was none on campus. And we started our own. And we did community service work. And we did MCAT prep. And we did work, you know, tied to helping students get more opportunities. So it still goes on today, 20 years later. But the job's not done. That's why. So you got to find people who share something with you, because that's your community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortega, Yanis, and Isaac. I still have time. I don't know if you all still have time to stick around and ask questions. I know I have all the questions, but for those of you, I know you might have like a 6:30 class or something. I just wanted to give you like a note that we're close to 6:30, but I'm happy to stick around. I don't know, Isaac, Yanis, Dr. Ortega, if you're free for a little bit more time.
Yep. And we got a couple minutes. So anybody have one more question in the chat? If not, we can wait till afterwards. Everybody good?
Please, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I want Bandusa too. Somebody said that in the chat. Now that you talked about that, I'm like, I want something sweet now. I think a lot of what we're talking about and hearing, and I hear the pain. Like I don't want to also just not acknowledge that, because I think we all have been going through, you know, a lot this last year, especially this last week. Today, you know, I think a lot of this hits us differently, you know, in the spaces that we're in, especially when we feel like those spaces are, you know, not inclusive to people of color, right, or to people from, you know, underrepresented backgrounds or, you know, poor communities. So I do want to also point that out too. So a lot of our identities are kind of all getting hit from these different angles. And when you're in these spaces, right, that you just want to connect, right? Like you want to connect with somebody without like explaining like, you know, this is why this is hitting me this way. I know for me, that means my colleagues, you know, my friends, my family, you know, that's really important. And I remember in graduate school, like also feeling that too, where it was like, you know, even though I did go to graduate school at Cal State Fullerton, our program was a lot different from my undergrad program. So the people that were accepted and the people that were there. So finding the people that you could connect with, even if it's one person. I found 2 people in my program and we are still really close to this day. But yeah, I don't know if you have like that one person you could just like call and be like, hey, I need to talk. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about your community and your people right now. Give them shout outs. Isaac, if you want to share? Oh, sorry, Emily, do you have a question? Do you ever hit a point where you wanted to give up, leave, etc.? And how did you overcome that, if so?
I guess I can talk to that. I always call my parents for advice. Like, it's so crazy how much like my parents have life advice that relates to grad school. And one of the things is like they always say like my parents are immigrants, and so like in a way me moving away and going to grad school and feeling lonely and all that stuff and dealing with like everything, you know, my dad will bring out his examples of like, well, I didn't see my parents for a very long time. I, you know, had to deal with the same things you did, or maybe worse, with like discrimination and or, you know, just like, at least what you're doing is not hard labor or something like that. So like, I think all of those things is, and like hearing my parents say that they're proud of me, like that goes a long way. And just like realizing that I am actually so lucky to be in this position. And even though I think it's like really hard, you know, I should be grateful that I have this opportunity. Doesn't mean that you can't feel what you feel. Like, you know, going to college, and sometimes you think, well, I can just go and do this, you know, this other thing and make money and help my family. But I think that going to school will honestly change your life, um, and you are learning so much more at Fullerton than just like your major. You know, you take other classes as well, so you learn a different perspective about the world, and I think that matters too, to like understand and grow as like a human being, I guess. And I think I also wanted to kind of give other examples of moments when I have experienced imposter syndrome. Like one that came in my head right now was like when I was in high school. I remember, well, like English wasn't my first language, and then when I was in high school, I wanted to get into college, obviously, and I like couldn't get into like the honors language arts classes, and I really wanted to, because I thought that, oh, well, if I don't speak, like this is always going to be my hurdle, like not being able to speak English and write and read well or something, you know. And then I ended up like getting into AP classes. I like begged my counselor. So like all those little things, like you have to kind of advocate for yourself. Like if I never begged my counselor to let me in, and then I ended up getting A's. I didn't take the AP exam, but you know, like little things like that, like advocating for yourself is also a big part of like getting over your imposter syndrome. Like don't let yourself down.
Thank you. Isaac, do you want to share, add?
Yeah, I think so I think one of like the frustrating things about like this feeling of wanting to give up and leave, it's something that, at least in my experience, like has happened multiple times, and it's always usually like when things are starting to become a little overwhelming, like when I have a lot of deadlines or when I have a lot of things on my plate. And often it's exacerbated not just by the fact that like I have a lot of things associated with school, but I have a lot of things associated with home. Like Annie said, like I live in Chicago and I'm going to school here, and essentially my entire like you know, I spend all of my time here physically, but like my mind is always back home. So then I also take on like the weight of what's going on back home in my family, and that can be at times a very difficult thing to like. It can be sometimes very difficult for me to like sort of weigh whether or not like I'm being, you know, sometimes I feel like I should be home. I feel like I should be home, and I think not being home is something that can be like one of the most, I think, like hardest things to deal with, is the fact that like I'm here all the time, but this isn't my home. And I think the ways that like I've overcome that is I sometimes like I just call my parents, or I call my brother, or I call my sister. I just like, sometimes it's just good to hear a familiar voice. Just good to hear someone tell you that like, hey, you know, like you're doing a good job. Like we're all very proud of you. We're all really happy to see you moving ahead. I you know, I draw a lot of strength from those who have come before me. Like Eunice, you know, I think about how my parents got here. I think about how my grandparents got here. My grandparents were migrant farm workers, who, you know, the cat is meowing really hard. Uh, and I think about all that they went through, and it's not always necessarily to like compare my struggle to theirs, but to try to also like sort of have some context for like, sometimes things will get hard, but that doesn't mean that they have to defeat us. And sometimes like losing a battle doesn't mean that you've like lost the war, you know, like having to ask for help, or having to feel like, you know what, for tonight I'm not going to get more done, that's okay. Like that can sometimes be one of those things of just like, it's you know, sometimes you just have to concede and just be like, you know what, for today this is as far as I'm getting, and that's all right. um yeah, so yeah, so I mean, I think a lot about my family, and I think a lot about sort of you know, how our struggles, even though in very different arenas, are very similar, and how they were able to overcome them. It gives me strength to be able to overcome them myself. So
Thank you so much,
And
both of you. And
I can
yeah,
give
go for it.
a very old man veterano perspective, right? So I did quit, to be honest with you. That's all I wanted to share. I left school for a year because my stress and my anxiety that Isaac and Yanis are feeling right now, I felt in college, because I went to a small liberal arts in Iowa that was very wealthy and very small and academically rigorous, and nothing that I was used to. And it was in the cornfields of Iowa. And I didn't know how to, I didn't know how to function there sometimes. So I, in my junior year, just quit going to classes and eventually withdrew and went home for a year and said, I'm not going back there, because that place is not for me. And I worked in a restaurant, uh, in the kitchen as a busboy and serving, depending on the day. And, but who made me go back, and the reason I overcame is the thing we've been talking about, right? You know, imposter syndrome made me leave because I naturally felt excluded from the process. But who made me go back is the people who I felt made me belong, my family and my friends. My friends, my mom's, you know, her affectionate homies from the hood, said, you're the only one doing this. You need to go back and do it for us. And how do you say no to the people you grew up your whole life with? I was so sad to miss my sister's Quince and to miss so many things when I was gone. But those things you can come back to eventually. And it was hard, but letting them down was harder. So, and now that I feel these things, and I do feel these things all the time, right? Do I want to quit because I'm so frustrated and angry and so little change, and people still feel these imposter syndrome and feel excluded and don't feel part of the process. But what makes me going is Yanis and Isaac and everybody in this room, for the most part, is if I don't do it and open these doors, who's going to do it? We got to do it for our families. We got to do it for each other. We got to open the door so that everybody can be included in the process and raise their voice, and like Yanis, advocate for themselves, so that we can have a, you know, a more inclusive conversation about what's the standard and is that for everybody. And so we don't feel like we can't meet that standard and then we're left out in the cold. And so it's about making sure everybody's represented. That's why I don't quit when I want to do it all the time. Thanks for that question, though.
Yes, thank you. And everyone's thanking you all in this chat for sharing your stories. I think you're validating a lot of fears and anxieties that people are sharing and feeling right now. And I love, you know, all of the work that you all have been doing, because I know, we know, right, this isn't just for ourselves, right? Like it always is about giving back and being with our community, and, you know, feeling like, you know, you could do it, but, you know, also like you have support, you have people that have your back. And I also hear too, right, that like a lot of first generation students, like all of us, like they, their families don't know how to navigate higher ed, or like they don't know, what it's like to be there, which is partially true, right? But I also am hearing from your stories that like they're also the ones that will have our back no matter what, and they will tell us that we could do it and will like push us through. So I also just want to, acknowledge the first generation part is also like a strength, right? Like it's not just like a weakness that, people tell us like, oh, well, you're the first one in your family to go to college. It's like, yeah, but I also learned so much from my family that got me through college, and that's still getting you all through. So thank you all for that. Any other questions in the chat?
I just wanted to say, like, so earlier this year, or late last year, my PI decided to leave Penn, and I had to switch labs, like basically midway through my PhD. And I freaked out, and I started like reaching toward like different people, getting different perspectives. And like, I went to a cafecito that you guys hosted, and after that, I directly like messaged Dr. Ortega, and I was like, this is what I'm going through. I need help. Like, please help me. And honestly, like when I was going through that, obviously the people at Penn that I would say like, oh, this is really discouraging or whatever, they want me to stay at Penn, So like hearing the tough love come from Dr. Ortega, which is like who has a similar background to me and has gone through all this, like really helped me like realize that he actually had my back, and he was telling me don't quit and everything's gonna be okay. It's gonna be tough, but like that's just how it is sometimes. Like hearing it from him was different from like hearing it from someone that, probably like I felt like you just don't want me to quit because, like you lose money or because it makes you look bad. Like I wanted to hear it and get a perspective from someone that was like, no, like you are still going to be okay. Like, and I went through this, and so like I am really grateful to also have the opportunity to hear experiences and see other people that look like me be in higher positions as well.
Thank you. Any advice? I think we have like final thoughts. I think some of the ones we wanted to share were, it's important to find community and support, right? And then to acknowledge too, right? We're speaking back to like these institutions where we are the first to be in, right? Like these are spaces that weren't created for us. Is there, and if there isn't a support system there in these spaces, how do we create that space for ourselves and for each other? And I think Dr. Ortega talked about, starting a group in his community as a grad student. How do we, continue to create these spaces and continue to create community and support, hosting, workshops like this and having these really real conversations, I think is super important. But for Isaac and Inés, like, how do we create these spaces for ourselves? Like, how do you do that, and for each other? And even if you're working on it now, you're trying to figure it out, any tips for us?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I started like I'm on the quarter system, so like about 6 months ago, so 2 quarters ago, I started a Spanish speaking group in my program, because one of the ways that I feel at home is when I'm able to speak Spanish. And one of the cool things about my program is that although it's not incredibly diverse, there is a small number of people who speak Spanish that come from other countries. So not only do I get to speak my the first language that I learned when I was a kid, I also get to learn new things about it. So it feels like I have a sort of dynamic relationship with something that gives me a lot of comfort. Another thing I also do, so I create, so partnering with students, sometimes it can feel like there's not a lot of us, but when you do find some of us, like let's get together and let's talk about what makes us feel good, and often that helps a lot. I think another thing too, and this may not be the case for everyone's experience in grad school, especially if you're not in a major city, but like being in Chicago, like there's a large Mexican American, Spanish speaking communities, and there's a diversity of other neighborhoods. So Chicago itself is sort of very segregated, but like if you're looking for a particular community, usually there's at least a small like group of them that live in a particular part. And it turns out the west side of Chicago just has a lot of Chicanos. And so like I go there as much as I can, like during COVID, you try to not be contributing to spread, but since things have gotten a little marginally better, I've been able to just go into a store and like listen to like someone and start a conversation with the cashier, and just that makes me feel so much better. Like giving myself the time and realizing like that's an important thing for me, and not just thinking that like, oh no, I'm a graduate student, so now all my life has to revolve around science, or all my life has to revolve around this thing. It's like, no, those other parts of me that like that I was more sort of intimately connected to when I was in California and when I was around my family and my friends are still important to me. So I carry those things with me, and I try to find them wherever I go. And I think continuously feeding that part of myself and being generous to that part of myself is something that I've learned helps me find my space, and then also help create space for others, because other people probably feel similarly. And if someone can just be like, hey, I grew up around people who spoke Spanish and I don't speak it very well myself, or I'm not, from a Spanish speaking culture, but I feel comfortable with it. Can I go with you? Like that kind of stuff ends up actually, like those experiences actually do end up materializing. And so, yeah, so I think, if you can create a community within your institution, if you can't, like sometimes there's the opportunity to go to where the people are at. So, like I was just like, where the Chicanos at? Where am I going to hear people speaking like me? I'm going to go to that neighborhood. So it helps.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do.
Yes, thank you. It feeds the soul, right? Like to do that. Eunice, do you have any other final thoughts or, kind of help to offer us?
I just want to say, like, if anyone ever needs anything, feel free to reach out. I can drop my email in the chat.
Same.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just said same.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all your lovely faces. I'm also going to stop recording. Thank you everyone for joining us.
And let me say one more thing.